Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I am your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we are going to be discussing xenophobia in South Africa. I am joined by a very special guest, Professor Loren Landau. Professor Landau is Professor of Migration and Development at the University of Oxford. He's also a research professor at the University of Witwatersrand, African Center for Migration and Society, and also the co-director of the WITS Oxford Mobility Governance Lab. Loren, you've written extensively on this subject, and generally subject on mobility and migration. It is a great pleasure to have you join me today, and I look forward to our conversation.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. So for some reason, South Africa has been known to has become a hallmark. Xenophobia has become a hallmark of South Africa. So to begin with, what is xenophobia and how does it manifest in South Africa?
Yeah, I think xenophobia is many things. Of course, its roots just mean a fear of the outsider. But the way we use it in contemporary language is usually an unease with people coming in from different communities, sometimes from elsewhere in the country, but usually from across the borders. So in Europe, it's basically become a term that's equivalent to racism. But when we talk about xenophobia in a place like South Africa, it's not a racial issue, but an issue of nationality and of origin. And we see it manifesting in many different ways, from keeping people out of school or denying them healthcare to official policy about immigration. But perhaps most famously, we see it manifesting in the form of violence, sort of hand-to-hand violence on the street, people's shops being attacked, people's bodies being attacked, communities or families being pushed out of their communities.
So you did make an important comparison between xenophobia in Europe and in South Africa. You talked about race, and you said in South Africa it's not about race; it's about nationality. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think what we see in South Africa is it's primarily attacks on foreign immigrants from other African countries. It's typically happening in the attacks are typically happening in poor areas, which in South Africa are largely African areas. But of course, if we look at the statistics, immigrants are unliked by people across the racial spectrum in South Africa. Whether you're white, black, Indian, colored, the sort of mixed race category in South Africa, there's generally an anti-immigrant bias. But what is really concerning is what's happening on the ground, typically in townships and poorer areas where people are being attacked. And they're not being attacked because they're African or Asian, they're being attacked because they're seen as outsiders, and either they're competing or they're somehow seen as threatening. That can happen against immigrants, but it also happens against other South Africans who are coming from different parts of the country. And it's all wrapped up in the politics, usually at a very local level.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned politics at the local level, because in your more recent publication, you talked about this dynamics and the nuance of how xenophobia manifests in Africa. You used something like spatial temporal analysis, and then you were kind of differentiating between the policies of xenophobia at the national level and talking about it at the local level, the local manifestation. And you're talking about co-authoring on how, these different spaces, how it modify these different spaces and the variations that it presents. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we see that people across the country, regardless of race or socioeconomic status, generally are quite anti-immigrant. And we also see that at the national policy level. Very recently, there's a new white paper on immigration. And if you read that paper, you would think that all of South Africa's problems are due to immigrants coming in, all the violence, all the disease, all the corruption, etc. But when we look at where the violence happens, it's not everywhere. Right? There's many neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, mixed, vibrant, sort of mobile neighborhoods where people live largely peacefully side by side. Then there's other neighborhoods where there's high levels of violence. And so our research, particularly the research I've done with Jean-Pierre Misago, has really looked into those neighborhoods where the violence happens to try to understand what's going on. And what we see is those are areas where there are conflicts among the South African population, where people are fighting for power, where they're trying to establish their authority, and immigrants get wrapped up in part of those kind of power plays.
Interesting. That's very, very interesting, because we've seen. So if I link that up to, I'll come back to South Africa for a minute. If I link that up to what's going on in Europe, let's bring it to the UK presently. What's happening here, where we are here, and we see where immigration or migration is a very strong campaigning issue between the Tory party and the Labour Party and everybody. And then we've seen the rise of far right groups, the rise of nationalism. We're looking at even how to curb legal migration and see how migration issue was one of the litmus tests, or one of the things used during Brexit, and how it's coming up again and saying, oh, it wasn't about migration, it was about getting power back from the EU. And how, so is it all about politics, or is there some truth in this? Is there an actual fear of migration, or is it just pure politics? Is there some truth in it, or should we just say it's just pure politics, like you said?
Well, I think that, wherever we see mobilizations against a group, whether it's an ethnic violence in Nigeria or Rwanda, or anti-immigrant sentiments in the UK, the US, Germany, or South Africa, there is always politics there. It doesn't just happen. Someone has to organize, and someone has to organize for a reason. We don't just stand up one day and go attack people, discriminate against them in a systematic way. But that said, I think there are certain things that make us prone to doing that. And whether it's in the UK or the US or South Africa, it's usually a sense that our people, the people who we feel deserve to be getting something, are not getting that. And if you look at the UK, you look at the US, there's a population that feels its status is slipping. And the same in South Africa. It's not so much that it was slipping, but that Black South Africans were promised benefits with the end of apartheid, and they haven't seen those benefits. So they feel like they're being robbed of something. And that makes us very angry and makes us very anxious. And so then it takes the politics to help frame and direct that anger. So the reason we're not getting rich, the reason we don't have jobs, the reason we don't have houses, of course, is not because of immigrants, but the politics comes in, and that's where the framing occurs. And then we start to see and believe, importantly, that it is immigrants or outsiders that are the reason we're suffering.
We've seen this. It's not even to say that South Africa, it's the hallmark of might to some extent be unfair. Maybe at the continental level, yes, because we've seen such rhetoric, even in America, like Riley pointed out. We've seen with Donald Trump. We've seen with issue of let's build a wall, and it's also a sticking point in the campaign as well in the ongoing elections in America. So looking at your work in terms of global mobilization, looking at the last maybe coming to a century now in terms of the patterns of migration and patterns of movement and that. Why are we seeing this? Why are we seeing people becoming more protectionist? Why are we seeing the rise of nationalism and all of that?
Right. This is a great question, and there's obviously no one single simple answer. But I think what we're seeing is really people generally feeling quite unmoored, quite insecure, quite uncertain about what the future holds. Whether it's because of various wars or globalization, the decline of state services, the decline of opportunities and wealth, the environment, whatever it is that is making us feel uncertain. And we as a species, I think, we are a tribal people. When we're threatened, we tend to retreat into our whatever group we see as ours, whether that's an ethnic group, or religious group, or a national group or a racial group. And I think that to some extent is what's happening. That the optimism of the past, of the post-Cold War period, or even the period of our parents, has given way to a greater sense of disorder. And people are looking for categories, for ways of being which restore some of that order. And so that means bordering. That means keeping out and putting a line around you so you don't engage with people from different politics and you don't engage with people from different cultures. Of course, the sort of horse has already bolted. Immigration, migration, mixing, hybridity is the way of the world. But I think it is something that makes people feel very uncertain. And this is part of that backlash to that uncertainty.
Amazing. I was going to take you up on what you said earlier on when you mentioned the dynamic manifestation of xenophobia in South Africa. And then you mentioned that it's not based on race, it's just based about in and out and access to resources and happiness. But it is fair to say that some nationality or some people have been specifically targeted. So in South Africa, though we've seen like some nationalities from Zimbabwe, from people from the bordering countries, but there's been a heightened tension between Nigerians. I think Nigerians in South Africa have received either much higher discrimination. I wanted you to comment on and see, do you believe that assessment, and if you believe, why is it so?
Well, I think it's true that Nigerians have a bad reputation in South Africa, and to be fair, in many parts of the world, there's been a sort of sense that Nigerians are bringing drugs, they're scammers, they're involved in prostitution or other things, and obviously, Nigerians have some reputation. There's some reason for that, but obviously, most Nigerians are not doing those things, right? What's interesting in South Africa is that Nigerians are seen that way, but they haven't been disproportionately the victims of attacks, in part because the kind of businesses and the kind of places that Nigerians go in South Africa are not usually in the townships. They're not in the areas that are highly violent. They're working in the inner city. They're working, in different kinds of places like that. So you'll see a lot of police harassment, for example, against Nigerians. but they're not being attacked in the way that Zimbabweans or Somalis or Pakistanis are, who are in the townships, who are working, selling, running shops, working in construction at that local level. And so, yes, there's a very strong sense that Nigerians are troublemakers. But when we look at the people who are being attacked, it's primarily people who are working or selling among other and living among other poor Black South Africans.
You mentioned something very interesting now, because I've seen some videos where you have non-state groups organizing, like vigilante groups, citizens, organizing against. But you mentioned something about police harassment. So does this manifest even at the state level? This level of discrimination, and how does that? Is it different from the citizens' approach? I didn't even know that it was more at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, what you have is a immigration policy that makes it very difficult for people to come into the country legally. And so the police have been asked to patrol, as they are everywhere, to protect the country from immigrants. They do arrest a lot of immigrants, and in the past have deported. In 2008, they deported well over 100,000 people, one of the most deportations per capita of any country in the world. That's slowed down, but what we see is that the police see immigrants as a way of making money. They can harass them and extort from them. Sometimes they even refer to them as mobile ATMs, because they know they won't have their papers in order, so we can stop them and harass them. What we also see, though, and I think this is just as important, is that the police are doing nothing or very, very little to investigate those vigilante groups that you just described. So they're also complicit in allowing these vigilante groups, which are really kind of gangsters, to take control and to regulate who comes in and out of the townships as they see fit. So there's been very few prosecutions, there's been very few investigations when this kind of violence takes place. So the police just stand back. They have no incentive to go in to fix this issue. So they'll continue to take money from the foreigners, but do nothing to protect them.
So, since we're talking about the policies that are in place, what are the policies do we have to tackle this?
Well, there's the immigration policy, which, South Africa has a very strong refugee and asylum policy, but very weak immigration policy. So there's basically from the region, it's almost impossible to come in and work unless you're recruited and highly skilled. So if you want to come in and work in finance, or you're working as an engineer in a company, it's possible to get a work permit. If you want to come in and start your own business, you want to come in and work as an electrician, it's very difficult unless you have a few $1 million in your pocket to be an investor. So most of the people who are living in the country either don't have documents or have documents that are not quite right, which means that it's you're always sort of on the edge, you're always on the outside, you're always at risk of being harassed, deported. And it feeds into a general sense that immigrants are lawbreakers, that they're here without permission. And to some extent that's true. But it's because it's almost impossible to come in legally.
I think it also feeds into that question of the myth of migration, where not just peculiar to South Africa, even in Europe, and we saw with the 2015 migration crisis, where in Europe, for instance, we have an aging population, and then with Brexit really exposed the shortage of labor, where even though the UK was retreated from the EU, they had, during the COVID, I think it was COVID, they had to employ some Europeans to come and work on the farms and stuff like that. So if I'm looking at in South Africa, for instance, if South African policies, is making it difficult for legal migration, restricted migration for people at the lower level. Does that mean that South Africa does not have a labor issue in terms of that level? Are they trying to protect the citizens to have access to this work?
Yeah, I mean, very few African countries have a shortage of sort of labor, right? I mean, the population growth rate in many African countries is high enough that there is surplus labor, and South Africa has an unemployment rate of somewhere around 40 or 45%. So there are a lot of people who are unemployed. So yes, South Africa doesn't necessarily need construction workers or people in that sort of restaurant hospitality workers from elsewhere, but it does need the kind of skills that are coming from Zimbabwe, from Kenya, from Mozambique, people who are electricians, people who are teachers, medical professionals, etc. In that sense, South Africa has a very severe labor shortage. And the policies as they are now are stopping South Africa from getting those people. The government says if we don't have these people from overseas, there'll be an incentive for private sector to train people and bring them in and create opportunities for South Africans. But what we're seeing is that can't happen fast enough, and it is working it's working against businesses in South Africa who are really struggling. It's working against the education sector who can't get enough math and science teachers to teach, especially in rural schools, and it's really working against the health sector, where there is a shortage of nurses and doctors, especially working in the public service.
Interesting. But if we look at it, I think Nigeria, it was Nigeria and South Africa. I know that South Africa has ratified the African Continental Free Trade, but I wanted to look how that can either resolve the issues of xenophobia or how that might challenge it. In terms of opening up of borders and the free trade. What can you say about that?
I mean, South Africa is very keen on obviously trade, and it has benefited enormously from investments South African companies have made across the continent, whether it's mining companies or MTN, which I think is huge in Nigeria, and ShopRite and a range of the hotels and other service companies. So South Africa is very much in favor of having the right to invest in the rest of the continent and to trade. It's one of the most industrialized, if not the most industrialized country on the continent. So it produces a lot, automobiles, refrigerators, electronics that are sold elsewhere. But it doesn't seem to understand that connection between trade and migration. And it doesn't seem to understand that allowing people into South Africa is a way of building goodwill for South Africa. And so what we're seeing instead is that the resistance to immigration and the xenophobia that we've been talking about is really hurting the South African brand. We're seeing companies face discrimination or difficulties when they want to invest elsewhere on the continent because those countries are saying, well, you have no respect for our citizens. I think Nigeria put a almost $1 billion fine on MTN soon after some range of xenophobic attacks as a way of sending a message, right? So, what we're seeing is a quite short-sighted response in which migration is seen as a security issue and is not being discussed vis-a-vis trade and investment and prosperity.
It's quite shocking because whilst we understand, how migration can be politicized, and you've mentioned how it's been securitized, and then what really amazes me is, like you rightly said, we see all these short-sighted kind of like policies at the government diplomatic level. We've seen so many. Recently, there was a tweet from someone that was traveling legally. I think it's the what do they call it, the reality show in South Africa, what do they call it, something African show, and I was traveling, and then they were just indiscriminately held at the airports for just no reason. But I think it's quite worrying and interesting how at that level, at that state level, not just the police now, we're talking about border control, where such brazen display of such discrimination happens. See, one tend not to look at it. One sees it as where is that brazenness coming from? Is it coming from? It has to come from the government, from the wider government. So what was the wider government doing at the maybe at the legislative level or the executive level? How are they tacitly or explicitly, allowing this to happen? And what is the conversation, at those level?
I think at that national level, you've seen since the end of apartheid in 1994 a real tension within the ANC, within the ruling party, between a group which was led by Mandela and then President Mbeki, which was quite Pan-Africanist, was very outward looking in its orientation and wanted to position South Africa as the continent's both economic leader, but more importantly, moral and political leader. And that was always countered by a group which really felt like South Africa needed to close itself off and develop its own kind of internal its own population, and to not worry about its position on the continent. Over the last few years, that Pan-Africanist perspective has really faded in South African politics and given rise to quite a strong nationalist sentiment. And so if we have the sort of people working at the border went from being kind of administrative officials, checking documents, registering, to being part of the security apparatus. And now there is something called the Border Management Agency, which they're dressed in almost military uniforms, and it's sending a very clear message that this border is not to be crossed unless we give you permission to do so. And I think that is something that has taken over South African politics, and it's not only the ruling party, it's every other party, and there's a national election coming up in a couple months. Every other party has made it a point that they will be stronger against immigrants. That is something that everyone seems to agree on.
It's quite amazing because when I look at it either by the global level, and that is why again I look at that interaction between politics and actual concern. When you look at it, that whilst this is happening, which is not peculiar to South Africa, the world is becoming even more connected in terms of the problem that we share, like climate change, like and all of this is that we have to collectively address. So it becomes like this irony and paradox, and say if the world is becoming retreating to the nationalist protectionist approach, how do we then deal with our collective threats that faces us as humans, whether at the continent or whether at the global level? Does this affect? Because again, if I link it up to what's happening in the Sahel and see with ECOWAS and see how, or sort of, for instance, in South Africa, and see how these countries need to cooperate in terms of cross-border, maybe terrorist threats and all of that. How does this impact on that, on this kind of corporations and threats?
You're absolutely right. We're in an era of kind of global challenges, whether it's Boko Haram or terrorism, whether it's the environment, whether it's even inequality, because corporations have moved production into very particular areas and kind of abandoned others. These are things that require approaches that work at multiple scales, from the very local all the way up to the global. And the way countries are politically organized doesn't facilitate addressing those challenges, whether, as you say, it's environment, terrorism, trade, inequality, the things that will shape the next generations. I think we do need to go and ask ourselves, is there a different kind of politics that we can imagine? One that, yes, takes care of people locally and engages builds community, helps us live fulfilling life in the place, but also is organized to recognize the kind of processes that we're dealing with. There's no such thing as a national economy anymore. You can't have a national environmental policy that will work if your neighbor or even the United States is not playing along. And the UN doesn't seem equipped for this. I think we as citizens, as residents, as migrants, have to help develop a different kind of language and imagination of politics that will allow us to grapple with some of these things rather than retreat into nationalism.
I'm glad you mentioned the UN, because I think I've seen your work. Maybe it's a report you've co-written with some authors on the UN about migration and discrimination. So we've seen in the UN itself, global and especially in Africa, we've seen its utility in terms of like intervening in conflict. So whether in Congo, where they've been asked to leave UN mission, whether it's in Mali, where they've been asked to pack away, and then we've seen, is the UN fit for purpose? Because we've seen since the post Second World War, do we need a new framework? Because we're already seeing those kind of, like, we've seen several coalitions, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's the BRICS plus, whether it's this multiple. Are we seeing a change in dynamics in what politics? We see what the different middle powers, superpowers. What implications does this have for the human race, for operation? Go on.
No, I was going to say it's difficult to imagine, because the UN is, after all, a club of states. And so while it might aspire to work at a kind of global level, it is still made up by states who are looking after their perceived self-interest. That interest, of course, can be redefined to be more internationalist. And I think we are in some areas starting to see that with the environment, a recognition that, one state might get ahead, but if in the long term, we're all going to suffer. That's been very slow in coming. That's something that we all know will fundamentally change the nature of humanity. And yet we're still not able to really grapple with it effectively. These issues of immigration, in some ways, are even harder because they're so closely connected to questions of identity, morality, value, that it takes a tremendous amount of imagination to be able to think about, how do we preserve culture? How do we preserve our values, our nature of a community, while also allowing people from different places to live with us, to move more freely, more safely? How do we manage cities? How do we manage countries if people are moving so freely? It does require different kinds of imagination. And I think there are people who are working to think through, how would we do this? But as of yet, and the African Union is trying that with they've introduced the Africa Passport. They've been trying to create a kind of continental free movement area. But ironically, it's the African countries that make up the AU are actively resisting that kind of regional or continental wide approach.
It's quite so this is where sometimes when I look at it as a student of African politics and development of African states, and you look at how we could look at the formation of states in Africa and say that it's an European project, and see how those states were arbitrarily created. But Africans themselves these African states have staunchly defended those borders that were inherited, and have resisted, like Riley said, resisted these continental, Pan-Africanist approach to things. And I wonder why. And then you're looking at within Africa itself, where internet trade, it's very, very limited. Why is it so? Why do Africans resist? Why are they defending such, inherited borders? And I don't know. Why do you think that is all?
I think it's a good question, and I guess the question is whether Africans are defending it or whether African leaders are defending these borders. And I think the political class certainly has an investment in the structures as they exist because that's where their wealth and power comes from. So if you're Kenyan and then you become, if you're a leader in Kenya, you get access to various kinds of kickbacks, etc. If all of a sudden you become part of the East African community and the investment happens at that level, you lose access to those resources. And so there has been a very strong incentive to play those politics at the national level. But ironically, what you're seeing now is, especially across the states north of the equator, the European Union is investing again in borders, in making those borders real and trying to stop people moving because they're afraid those people will move to Europe. And so once again, we have these local leaders who have benefited in the past from the state system now taking money for aid and border control and further reinforcing these sorts of national divisions, which, as you say, are for the most part European creations to begin with.
That's quite interesting that you mentioned the EU, and this is where, because I've got one of my students is actually working on a very important global migration and looking at the myth of migration. And you look at the EU's Africa migration policy. You look at how the EU is talking of having, externalizing that border, shifting that border, when having offshore centers where they process stuff. Or you could talk about the ongoing, migration agreement with Rwanda and how they want to do all of that. You look at all of that and you say, so when you look at all those kind of arrangements and look at how in the past, I think it was during, I think they had, the EU had a bilateral agreement with Nigeria and a few other countries. What is the AU itself? The AU, the African Union, how is African Union positioning itself? Because I know they have this AU 2063 agenda and how, African solution for African problems, and how are they positioning themselves in terms of like dealing with these issues?
I'm not an expert on the AU per se, but I know that they have struggled. As we talked about, they've been pushing an agenda around the African passport, increasing trade between countries, free movement of goods, freer movement of people. And these efforts have run smack into the bilateral agreements that the European Union is forging, certainly across North Africa, very explicitly, but I think with 11 or 12 other African states, which are about preventing this kind of free movement. The challenge for the African Union, of course, is that even if they have the kind of formal authority, they have very few resources. So unlike the European Union, which collects tax and has a significant contributions from its member states, the African Union is still largely dependent on donor money, some African support, of course, but they don't have the same kind of authority. And so when a country like Ethiopia, one of the largest countries, makes a deal with the European Union, the African Union, which is based right there in Ethiopia, can't really do anything about it.
Interesting. Before I come to some of the solutions that are way forward, you mentioned something early on that I forgot to take you on. Within South Africa itself, you mentioned internet discrimination or internet xenophobia. So I know in Nigeria, for instance, they've got several ethnic groups where you could see whether the Igbos or Igbo or the Yorubas, this and that. But in South Africa, beyond the apartheid situation between the black and white, what are these other internet discrimination that does not involve other non-nationals?
Right. So, I mean, part of the apartheid government was not just separating people by kind of racial categories into Indian, colored, black, and white, but also separating ethnic groups. So much like they did in Nigeria, in a kind of indirect rule, where it's different ethnic groups were given their own homelands and had their own sort of leadership structures. And some of that created tensions between those groups, who were then competing with each other for access to jobs, services, etc. And some of those leadership structures have remained in the post-apartheid period. So you have very strong ethnic identities and ethnic politics in some places. We often don't like to talk about those things because the racial dynamic is really the big one. But we do see in neighborhoods and areas those groups being very resistant to welcoming other South Africans from other ethnic groups, even from neighboring sort of towns, into their spaces out of fear that it's going to undermine that power. So, yeah, it's another legacy of the kind of colonial or apartheid indirect rule system, which we've seen across Africa, which played ethnic groups off against each other. And those legacies have continued into the post-colonial or post-apartheid period.
Okay, before I come to the last question, what are the do you know any what are the grassroots initiatives, or whether the organizations like yourself or centers that you run that are working to combat this discrimination, xenophobia, and promoting integration?
Yeah. We don't see a very strong voice. So, in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, we see very strong anti-immigrant politics, but you also see political parties and groups saying, no, that's not who we are. We're a tolerant society. We recognize we must have immigrants. We must be diverse. In South Africa, those voices are very quiet. So there are groups that work at a local level on conflict resolution, at the community level, trying to promote understanding and peaceful coexistence. But at the national level, we have a few NGOs, a few advocates, but they've struggled with funding and they struggled to find a voice that can be heard. And I think South Africans are rightfully very concerned with an electricity crisis, with economic crisis, with not having access to water, with general levels of physical insecurity, crime, corruption. They're not that interested in thinking through, okay, how do we now make life better for immigrants? People are concerned with making their lives livable for themselves. And so, the challenge is, these things keep happening. The violence against foreigners keeps happening, but it's very hard to have a reasoned conversation about it. And so far, there's been very few groups that have been able to do so.
Okay, let me come to the last question, and it's going to be more broad, different layers. This question: how, looking ahead, what do you envision? Let's start from a global perspective in terms of the global migration crisis. How do you, and then come to South Africa at the continental level, and then come to South Africa? Because before in your book, I think one of the book you wrote, I think it was about, if not coming to 20 years ago, when you were talking about xenophobia in South Africa and the problems related to it, you did say there's one statement that caught my attention. You said South Africa is a highly xenophobic society, which out of fear of foreigners does not naturally value the human rights of non-nationals. So I wanted to envision a way forward. How do what are the solutions, what strategies, what laws, what pragmatic approaches can be put in place to improve the situation in South Africa? And then if you can touch on globally, how do we accommodate, which is rightly so, the citizens are right to, let's be a bit selfish, to look at for their own. We have a living crisis situation, but how do we resolve that situation without necessarily infringing on the human rights or rights of others? Talk about we and others. How do we resolve that?
Right. I mean, I think at all levels, whether it's at the local level or globally, there is a need to shift the way in which we think from this: if the other person has something, I will necessarily lose. And what we're looking at is a world where the people are moving, and the territorial basis of politics is being redefined by artificial intelligence, by the internet, by trade. And we're still stuck in the language of local level citizenship and national citizenship, which is out of sorts, it's not calibrated to how real world processes are taking place. And as we talked before about the kinds of problems we have have to solve. I think what will happen in the next 50 years is those politics will shift. It's unlikely that the politics that really matter will be the ones organized by nation states. We'll start to see other kinds of political formations taking shape, and we already see that with the UN, but also with some of the Pentecostal churches or private corporations, which are essentially taking on a role of governing transnational processes, flows of money, investments, values, forms of belonging. So I think that will take shape in a different way. In the short term, I think we do need to think about how do we incentivize people to include rather than exclude, or to at least ignore rather than exclude, to just let people be, and sometimes that's the best. And we can see that, in many countries historically, if you wanted to move from one city to another, you needed to get permission. You needed to get a sort of king's approval or the local. But now, if you want to move from one part of the UK to another, you just do it. And we start to see that at the European Union. You can just move. Sure, there are issues and it's not completely smooth, but people can reinvent themselves. They can reimagine what's possible. And hopefully we can get to that point, especially recognizing the coloniality of these borders in Africa, where people don't cling to this idea of nationality as something that defines who you are as a human, but can look at somebody and be like, well, if you're here and you're not harming anybody, you're not harming anyone by stealing, through violence, through crime, well, then just get on with it. And hopefully, that's where we can get.
Brilliant. I want to share your optimism and hope that we can, whether in our lifetime or in the lifetime of our kids, that will be a reality. And I don't think that is far-fetched. Once again, Professor Landau, I'm really sorry for the first miss up of the time. I'm
no
grateful
problem. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm grateful for your time and your perspective that you shared with us, and we're really glad and happy to have you join us.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, viewers, for joining us for another exciting episode on xenophobia in South Africa. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I do. I encourage you to tune in again next week for another interesting episode. For now, take care and I'll see you soon.